Welcome to this edition of our weekly Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series focused on the war the Chinese Communist Party is waging against this country, particularly the unrestricted form of warfare that it has engaged in for 30 years at least, but also the growing likelihood that the cumulative effect of the warfare that it has conducted in this fashion, this stealthy, multi-front, practically omnifront warfare, short only of the explosive kind of shooting war, the damage that it has done is something that we try to explore, expose, and impress upon our audience is the formula for our destruction if we do not recognize that that is exactly what the Chinese Communist Party is seeking and do something about it in time. This particular program is devoted to one aspect of the unrestricted warfare of the CCP that has been a hardy perennial of its efforts to take down our country, actually predating Deng Xiaoping and his efforts to, through a strategy he called hide and bide, bring about our defeat. I think it goes back probably to the founding, because political warfare has been part of the DNA of the Chinese Communist Party, certainly from Mao Zedong's revolutionary days. We have always been a target of political warfare, among other kinds, for the Chinese because we are the impediment to the realization of their unwavering determination to become the world's sole power, dominating, in fact, the entire planet. So how does political warfare factor into this kind of unrestricted campaign for the destruction of the United States? Well, it turns out in a lot of different ways, and we're going to try to do justice to many of them, if not all, in the course of this program, especially in light of a very important report issued by the State Department this week, in which focus is put on the specific efforts that the Chinese are making to engage in that sort of political warfare here inside the United States. And we're going to be examining how that has translated into the fracturing of our society, truly the divide and conquer strategy at work, and the kinds of organizations that we now know, it's long been suspected, long been asserted for that matter, but we now know on the basis of the United States government's documentation, are actually, yes, enemies within and working for the Chinese Communist Party. Two in particular will be the focus of some of our most important insights and revelations in the course of this program: Code Pink and People's Forum. We're going to start with an overview, as we often do, from one of our country's most, accomplished and certainly most insightful intelligence analysts. His name is Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired. He is a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China. We are very proud of that fact. He has been not only in uniform, one of the most, I think, formidable monitors, observers, analysts, and warners about the Chinese Communist Party of our time. But since he took off that uniform, he has continued to serve our country, notably by making available information on what he calls the main thing through a wonderful Google group called Red Storm Risen. He is the co-author with Dr. Bradley Thayer of a tremendously important book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. You can also follow his writings, I think, pretty much weekly at American Greatness. We spoke with him yesterday, as I recall, on our program, Securing America, and the entire conversation is very much worth a listen. You can find it at securingamerica.substack.com. But we've asked, with his permission, to excerpt a portion of it, relatively short, but a perfect scene setter for the conversation we're going to be about. And we'll go to the videotape with Captain James Fennell right now.
House Ways and Means Committee held a hearing on this influence that's coming from dark money and into NGOs. And one person who was identified was this Roy Singham, who's a U.S. citizen, but resides in Shanghai. And he sits atop a very vast fortune of money that he uses to buy influence and basically propagandize the American citizenry. And he does it through various organizations. One of them is Code Pink, which is a far left organization that roams around Capitol Hill and screams at one political party on the Hill, and then they screamed at the president at dinner a couple of months ago. They're very much far left. Even a few years ago, they were anti-Chinese, but now that they're doing this Neville Roy Singham, they have changed their tune, and they're putting out the propaganda that the Chinese Communist Party wants to have, along with another group called People's Forum. So what we heard in the hearing yesterday in Congress is that this is an active United Front Workers Department campaign to influence America with political warfare, information warfare, and things of that nature. And so we need to be on the lookout for this. I'm glad that the Ways and Means Committee was. My recommendation would be to get this over to the Department of Justice, start looking into racketeering charges, RICO statutes, and start treating this as for the criminal activity that it is, and start having real indictments levied against these people that are doing this activity, and start freezing some of this money, because it is, as they said in the hearing yesterday, one of the analysts there talked about, they're trying to influence three things that anybody that watches the news today can see. They're funding the migrant turmoil, they're funding the election turmoil, and they're funding the disruption or protest turmoil. And those are three areas that any person that turns on the evening news, no matter what channel you're watching, you see reports of this. And this is all being funded in part by the Chinese Communist Party, and it's coming through a guy who's an American citizen that resides in China, in the People's Republic of China. So we should be cracking down on this, not just not considering it some kind of, it's political speech or something like that. This is active subversion, and we shouldn't stand for it. We should stop it, and we should use every legal tool in the book to make sure that they can't spread this propaganda, which is about destroying America and tearing the country apart.
Subversion indeed. And treason, it would seem to me, on part of this chap, Singham. We're going to talk more about him in a moment. Before we do, though, perhaps a little bit out of order, but very much to the point, we're going to hear from one of our valued journalists in this battle space. He is Jan Jekielek. He is an editor with Epoch Times. He is also the host of a terrific interview program, America Thought Leaders. And he is not least the author of a brand new book, and I mean brand new, hot off the presses, entitled Killed to Order, China's Organ Harvesting Industry and the True Nature of America's Biggest Adversary. He has been very actively involved in both reporting on and warning about Chinese subversion inside the United States. And we're very pleased to have him with us to talk a bit about one of the manifestations of that involves people in the Falun Gong faith community, of which he's a member, including its absolutely spectacular dance company, Shenyun. Jan, thank you for finding time for this important contribution to this program. Over to you.
Thank you for having me. This is absolutely wonderful, and it's also kind of auspicious that I get to thank in person Jim Fennell and Brian Kennedy for endorsing my book Killed to Order, among many others. Actually, it was kind of crazy. I sent out a whole bunch of requests to different people, and like 80 people wrote back. So it's quite and the book is something that actually relates to this topic. I won't start with that, but killedtoorder.com if you're interested in knowing more. It isn't a shock to learn that, to get kind of official clarification around Neville Singham and Code Pink doing their work. If you're on the Hill here in Washington, D.C., and you go to any China-related event, the Code Pink people are there. In some ways, it almost feels performative in some cases, where they just kind of launch their protest against anything that might make communist China or the Chinese Communist Party look bad. I mean, you watch this happen and you think to yourself, how weird is this? And these are not Chinese people. These are very, very left-wing, typically middle-aged women that are playing that role. At least that's my anecdotal observation around the Code Pink people that I've always been seeing. Neville Singham, for whatever reason, intellectually aligned with the Chinese Communist Party, has his offices there, lives there as far to the best of my knowledge, and kind of endorses the ideology, and I guess is interested in seeing more of that appear in America. I think it's bizarre. I was at one of the recent Shenyun performances at Kennedy Center, and I noticed there was actually a small group of protesters out there. And, so this is like anti-Shenyun protesters, it's like, again, it's a dance performance, right? So there's always, it's a very strange thing sometimes to see that. And, they've got all sorts of weird placards and essentially set up to try to demonize both Shenyun and Falun Gong. Many of the performers in this Shenyun dance performance, which maybe I should kind of explain briefly what it is, are actually Falun Gong practitioners. And its tagline is China before communism. It visits, I heard, 1 to 2 million audience members a year. There's 8 touring companies that involve, basically dance and also a full orchestra. And they, some of the greatest stages in the world they go to. And among other things, they explain to the world that the great things about China have nothing to do with the Chinese Communist Party, which is, of course, the exact opposite of what the Chinese Communist Party propaganda is, which is that everything that's good about China comes from the wellspring of the Chinese Communist Party. This is what they would like everyone to believe. This is the constant brainwashing. And just as a little note, if I'm going to speak to Kill to Order briefly, the book isn't just about the forced organ harvesting industry. It's about explaining how it's a perfect lens for understanding communism. And an important part of this is that the supremacy of the Communist Party is always at the top. It's the greatest social good. You can imagine, right? You hear this term where we want to do things for the greater good, right? And in every communist society, the greatest good of all is the supremacy and the survival of the Communist Party. So you can imagine why now mass atrocities are a common feature of every communist system that's ever existed, because, well, the human life and dignity of the individual is a distant second or third or 150th or something like that. So now how does this apply in the political warfare space? I'm just going to speak to this a little bit briefly using the Shenyun example, okay? But so since about 2022, I mean, the CCP has been obsessed with trying to destroy Shenyun since its inception in 2006 in all sorts of ways. But since 2022, they've really kind of upped their game beyond the typical, like, you know, when I say typical, it sounds kind of bizarre, but like slashing of tires, intimidation of people, the typical, like what we would call transnational repression in the human rights space. So that kind of stuff had been happening. They'd be calling theaters, okay, and saying, you guys shouldn't work with Shenyun. In some cases, that really backfired on them because they would even write to congressional members and state house members and so forth saying, you know, it would be bad form to see this show, and people would be kind of outraged. Why is the Chinese consulate or embassy or supposed representatives reaching out to us telling us not to participate in this show, right? It sounds weird, right? Well, imagine this, okay? There are 2 Chinese agents that are currently in prison because what they did was they tried to bribe an IRS agent to revoke Shenyun's nonprofit status, okay? Except that the IRS agent wasn't an IRS agent; he was actually an FBI agent. This was a sting operation, and you know, these 2 agents are in jail. But just to give you an idea of the lengths that they want to go to, and one of the really kind of tragic parts for Shenyun, which is always seeking to grow and seeking to build its audiences, and by the way, did it painstakingly without a lot of, you know, corporate support, which a lot of the arts have really needed to survive. Shenyun kind of built it the bootstrap, build it American dream way, right? Shenyun has actually been sort of, well, the best way to describe it, I believe that wittingly or unwittingly, the New York Times has been kind of used by the Chinese Communist Party to push its anti-Shenyun narratives, and with, you know, kind of showcasing disgruntled people who had a few disgruntled people who had once been with Shenyun, not disclosing conflicts of interest that those people have with Chinese Communist Party entities in many cases, and so forth. So the way this political warfare manifests, right? And then there's, you know, all sorts of frivolous lawsuits that were launched against basically the campus where Shenyun dancers train in the school that trains them. You know, most recently dismissed with prejudice, you know, after many attempts. So, you know, there's this kind of legal aspect of the political warfare. There's this, you know, kind of using the, you know, almost like kind of like this weird kind of lobbying effort that they engaged in with the FBI and so forth. And then there's, you know, it really seems to me like a kind of co-opting of U.S. media apparatus to try to, again, sort of, you know, attack an entity that stands clearly against the Chinese Communist Party. You know, China before communism, again, is its tagline. So, and that's just sort of one window into this broader campaign. And as I started, I mentioned that, you know, these protesters, I don't know if they were Code Pink or not, but or you know, some of these other groups that were funded by Neville Singham, but their slogans certainly were completely aligned with those groups and Code Pink. So it's funny how there's this overlap between all of these efforts. I think that's all I'll share at this point.
I think you don't mean funny as in ha ha, but peculiar and ridiculous, maybe, but dangerous as well. And thank you for sharing the story about the New York Times, Jana. This is really a scandal that I think the Chinese Communist Party has bought the New York Times, and you see it in its reporting on a lot of things, but this is a particularly, I believe, egregious example of, well, pay to play. Their supplements, I don't know if they're still doing them as frequently as they used to, but the so-called news items that were actually advertisements is just an example, again, of how that particular organ has been used as a part of this larger influence operation of the CCP, namely to undermine America. We're going to hear from another of our regular contributors to these programs next, a man who has a distinguished record as a military officer as well as a foreign service officer. He's been a businessman in East Asia for many years as well. That would be Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired. He too is an author of a best-selling book entitled When China Attacks, A Warning to America. He is also a frequent contributor to our program, Securing America. He's going to be seen in that role, in fact, in a video clip that we have extracted from a wonderful interview that he did with me, I believe, yesterday as well. Let's go to the videotape with Colonel Grant Newsham now.
I'll try to put this into a larger context. Now, I watched a good bit of the hearings yesterday, read about the transcripts. And the optimist, if you wake up and you want to cheer yourself up and say, well, finally, somebody is talking about this. The China Select Committee in Congress does excellent work. The State Department as well, I can't recall hearing something like this. You were getting very close and similar during the first Trump administration. But before that or since, I'd never seen it. So that, is a good thing to finally see. Now, the bad news is that World War III has already started, and we're on the road to losing it. Now, you might say, well, how has it actually started? Because nobody's actually been shooting. Well, remember that there's two different conceptions of war. With us, unless you actually start shooting, you're not actually at war. To the Chinese, the shooting part is just the very end. And they have been fighting and waging a very successful war against us. It's not a shooting war, but it's a political war, and generally comes under the terms political warfare. Now, political warfare is kind of an umbrella term for a number of different activities, ranging from economic warfare, psychological warfare, drug warfare, financial warfare, lawfare, using America's legal system against it, proxy warfare. And I'll just focus on a couple of these because you see these at work through the Code Pinks, the Neville Singhams of the world. And they have been very successful getting Americans to actually do their jobs for them. If you look out in these riots and look into their structures, there's very few Chinese people to be found. They're behind the scenes, but you have the people in your intended victim, your intended target country, actually doing the work for you. And this has worked immensely well for the Chinese over the years. You ask yourself, how many times have you heard American experts say, well, China's not really communist? Well, all they want to do is make money. How many times have you heard American businessmen, CEOs say Tim Cook from Apple, well, we just have to be in China. We have to. Word about human rights, nothing at all. You look at the American, say the green energy industry, solar industry. Well, Americans invented the technology, the Chinese stole it, put it on sort of economic, giant manufacturing scale, and now they sell the stuff into America and have put all the American companies out of business. Now, who is it that is lobbying in Congress to ensure that the Chinese imports don't stop? Well, that's China's American proxies, the law firms, the lobbyists, and the people on Capitol Hill who support China's interests. So this proxy warfare has been immensely effective. And by doing all of this, you create a constituency in the United States which is pro-China or sees pro-China as where its paycheck comes from. And at that point, you can see how deftly China has gone about actually hurting us. And you look at the economic warfare as well. We'll throw in that. Consider of the last 30 years. Well, we've moved so much of our manufacturing to China. And you've hollowed out American cities, American neighborhoods, separated Americans from their lives. And that was all done as a result of successful Chinese political warfare. And you got Americans to think, we have to be in China. China's not our enemy, it's our friend. And this is creating a dependency. And because if we want things made, well, so much of it has to be made in China. If we want drugs, well, China makes most of them. If we want the so-called critical minerals that you need for everything from iPhones to F-35 fighters. Well, it comes from China. We're dependent. You saw how effective this was a year ago when President Trump came into office and he tried to really get tough on China. Remember, he put tariffs up to 140%, suggested they might even go higher. Well, the Chinese said, well, not so fast, Donald. We have these rare earths, and without them, your business is shut down. And you had major CEOs coming into the White House saying, look, we got 2 weeks or we close down. And that caused President Trump to stop in his tracks and even back up. And that shows you just how effective the war has been. They didn't have to fire a shot. They didn't have to deploy the People's Liberation Army. They had just built up through successful political warfare, the economic end of it, the psychological warfare end of it, the strength that really handcuffed the United States. Trying to get out of it is proving very hard. And part of another thing that you try to do is you want to destroy, you want to break down your opponent, the so-called entropic warfare. You want to cause friction. You want to make Americans start to see each other as the enemies. And that is where the groups like Code Pink, the Tides organization, and go back to Black Lives Matter, Antifa. Well, this goes back, the Chinese connections go back to the 60s with the Black Panthers, if anyone bothers to look. Michael Waller from Center for Security Policy does excellent work on this. But the Chinese connections are there, and you just have to look at it, but think of the harm that has done. When you have Americans really starting to hate each other, when you have American cities in flames, well, how much better does it get from the Chinese perspective? And once again, they haven't had to, deploy the military to do this at all. Now, back to the proxy examples, and there's really no limit to those. I would, in fact, argue that one of the, the most successful ones, besides Hunter Biden probably, was actually Hank Paulson, the former Goldman Sachs executive, was Secretary of Treasury. He did more to help China build up its financial system, its economy, than probably anyone in America. And he's pedigreed, a decent guy, but the Chinese very successfully worked on him, and you appeal to American greed, vanity, naivete, and really when there's a certain type of American, you find a lot of them on Wall Street, when they smell money, they act like a sea lion at SeaWorld who thinks he's going to get a mackerel snack, turn themselves into pretzels. But TikTok is another good example. The Indians banned TikTok in about 72 hours, about 4 or 5 years ago, after they had a fight with the Chinese up on the northern border. We can't figure out how to do that. And when you saw, this was a while back, the president of of TikTok testifying before Congress, and he was, of course, saying the things they would say. But the most interesting thing, the most telling, was behind him was a phalanx of lawyers and lobbyists, all white people, all Americans, who were there to do the Chinese Communist Party's bidding. And that is successful warfare. Imagine if you could turn all this on its head, we could do that to them. We would be patting ourselves on the back to no end. We would have far less concerns about China because we would know that they are nowhere near the military or economic threat that they should be, nor psychologically prepared to take us on. Additionally, is one outcome it's an aspect of political warfare. I mentioned drug warfare, fentanyl. We talk about this all the time. It's killed well over 750,000 Americans since about 2013, and that's the dead. The wounded are many times more. So every year, China takes 2 or 3 divisions off the battlefield for us. What has the American response been? Nothing. Capitol Hill has never put any serious punishment on the Chinese for doing this. And that is successful political warfare. So again, to the Chinese it's war, to us, well, it hasn't started because there's no shooting. And all we have to do is talk to them. If we engage, negotiate, understand their position, well, we can work something out. Well, we'll discover we're wrong about that at some point when we either cannot move or that we find ourselves under attack and there's nothing that we can do. Now, another example of how successful this has been is that until 2017 in the U.S. military, you couldn't even say China was an adversary. You couldn't use the word adversary. You certainly couldn't say enemy. So it wasn't until Mr. Trump came along that finally you could say this, despite the evidence being clear for 30 years. And once again, this is the outcome of successful political warfare. So the Code Pinks, the Neville Singhams, these These are one front in a multi-front war that's being waged against us. Now, you'd think, well, man, they're doing this to us. Well, certainly we're doing that to them. Well, actually, the bad news is we're not. We don't even have a political warfare scheme, a strategy. We don't do it. And you must say, well, somewhere. No, it isn't. We just don't do it.
We just don't do it. What an understatement. Colonel Newsham, thank you. This is an extremely helpful overview and synthesis of what is actually going on and has been for so long. I would just, in addition to making it clear that I too have endorsed Killed to Order, I guess not quite in the formal way that our many colleagues have, but we did a wonderful interview with Jan Jekielek recently, and I'm all about it. But there's also two other books that I just want to mention in this very important context, namely Lee Smith's book, The Permanent Coup, and Peter Schweitzer's brand new national #1 bestseller, even in the New York Times, The Invisible Coup. And both of these chronicle what has been done by the Chinese Communist Party as part of its political warfare by capturing our elites and weaponizing them against our country. Happens it's the topic also of a book that came out of many of these, I think the first 70 of these, some 220 now, webinars. My colleague and I, D.D. Laugesen, wrote about 2 years ago now, entitled The Indictment, prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and friends for crimes against America, China, and the world. I commend all of these to you because they will provide you much, much more detail on how the political warfare strategy of the Chinese Communist Party has been waged against us to such incredible effect. We're going to turn next to another of our very important colleagues on the Committee on the Present Danger of China, one of the founding members, a man whose expertise in matters of political warfare in particular, as well as his insights into the nature of the CCP and the threat that it poses to us, and various ways in which we can defeat that threat, including in the so-called public diplomacy, information warfare battle space. His name is Dr. John Linchowski. He is a man who served, as did I, many years ago, in his case with great distinction on the National Security Council and in the State Department under President Ronald Reagan. He was one of the very few who were directly involved and read in on the strategy for taking down that last totalitarian communist ideology and nation and regime operating under it back in the Cold War. He has also been an incredible contributor to, I believe, the passing on of the torch in the fight for freedom to new generations through the Institute for the Study, which one is it? I'm sorry, the Institute for, that'll come to me.
World politics.
There we go. His contribution, not least as the founder of the Institute for World Politics, of which he is now the President Emeritus and Chancellor, I believe, is of incalculable importance. Is this fight goes on, needless to say, past this generation. Our old boss, Ronald Reagan, said every generation faces an existential threat to freedom, and this is clearly ours. And John Linchowski's been doing an outsized job in helping us understand the magnitude of it, the importance of fighting it. We have him by video as well. Let's go to that now, please.
The latest news about Code Pink being associated with, if not a direct part of Chinese political influence operations, is really part of a much larger pattern that has been going on for many years in this country. And it's finally and amazingly being recognized by people at the highest levels. And fortunately, our new Department of State's Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy is paying attention to these matters, as are others in our government. But let's just put this in a larger context. The Chinese have been busy building an infrastructure of strategic influence in this country. And I want to say the Communist Chinese, because I like to make a distinction between the Communist Party and the Chinese people and the Chinese nation. And they are not the same thing. The Communist Party does not represent the entire Chinese nation. But they have been influencing our academic community. They've set up over 100 Confucius Institutes at American universities. Some of them have been allegedly shut down after widespread protests, but they've been renamed and continue the same activity. They have been essentially corrupting many of our China experts in our universities and our think tanks. Some half-dozen blue-chip think tanks in Washington and New York have done joint projects with front organizations of Chinese intelligence, have taken money from those front organizations. The Chinese invite students from the professional schools of international relations, as well as law schools, to come to China for all expense-paid tours where they're treated lavishly. They have been bribing our media. For years, the New York Times and the Washington Post took millions of dollars from Chinese propaganda operations in order to publish communist Chinese propaganda, specifically the so-called China Watch supplement that came every couple of weeks. And the problem, of course, with that was not so much what appeared in that propaganda, but what those newspapers failed to report about strategic developments that the Chinese were doing that are inimical to the national security interests of the United States. And so there was only one newspaper of note in the entire country where you could reliably get information about the Chinese military buildup, about their espionage, about their strategic influence operations, and that was the Washington Times. And that still is pretty much the case because the New York Times and the Washington Post don't really pay that much attention to these matters. The Chinese have been influencing Hollywood, and they do it by limiting the number of American films that can enter into the China market. They let only some 25 or 30 films in every year. And if American movie studios want to get a chunk of that market, they cannot do anything in those films that would offend the Chinese Communist Party. So they censor themselves. And sometimes they even try to curry favor in their movies by making Chinese figures the heroes of those movies. If they film something that Beijing doesn't like, then they will be put on a blacklist. The actors will be put on a blacklist, and they'll be prevented. The studio and the actors will be prevented from ever being able to sell again in the China market. They try to influence our retired military by having so-called military-to-military dialogue. And in many respects, it is a strategic deception operation, and too many of our former flag officers have fallen for this, and give the world the impression that things can be normalized with China. And perhaps the worst thing of all is how many of our elder statesmen, the former secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, intelligence agency directors, are directly, have been or are directly or indirectly on Beijing's payroll. What they do is when they finish their public service, they go to one of these consulting firms like the Cohen Group, which is the former Secretary of Defense William Cohen, or the Stonebridge Group, which is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's consulting company, and they open doors in Beijing for American corporations. The American company gets a nice, cozy, monopolistic arrangement in doing business with Beijing. They get lots of money, and the money goes to the elder statesmen. And of course, these people don't. If they're ever called to testify about China in congressional hearings, they don't reveal the conflict of interest. And it happens that one of our former professors, China expert, was complaining about this. He was working for a major think tank, but it happened that there was a former Secretary of State who was on the board of that think tank and arranged to have our professor fired from there for complaining about how people like him were involved in and have been essentially on Beijing's payroll. That particular former Secretary of State was directly on the payroll of a front organization of the Chinese so-called People's Liberation Army. I don't want to call it that. It should be really, because that's a lie. It's not. If you say People's Liberation Army, it's not people's, it's not a national army, it's a Communist Party army. It's not liberation, it's slavery. It should be called the Chinese Communist Armed Forces. In any event, that's just a slice of how much Communist Chinese are involved in our country, and they go down to the very granular level. They show up at PTA meetings. They try to recruit state legislators and mayors, knowing that they may become may become congressmen or senators someday in the future. Consciousness of this is finally being raised in this country, and we should be restricting the access to our country so that Chinese political actors cannot be influencing us the way they do.
John Lachowski, what a remarkable complement to what we've been describing elsewhere in this program. You picked up on a point that I was alluding to in terms of the compromise, to put it charitably, of outfits like the New York Times, and you added the Washington Post. I would add, on the good side, the people who are faithfully reporting on what the Chinese Communist Party is up to. In addition to the Washington Times, which I was proud to have a column in for 25 years, the Epoch Times is clearly in, I think, the category of extraordinary publications, and I'm saying that not just because Jan Yakulek is on with us, but because he and his colleagues are doing surpassingly important work there, and don't often get the credit that they deserve, and in fact are, as we talked about earlier, being subjected to political warfare, the very, very direct kind, by the Chinese Communist Party. We have another presenter who I thought would be with us about. See her? Well, I do see her. She has just turned up. Praise God. Unmute, my dear. Her name is Cleo Pascal. She too is a dear and valued colleague of all of ours. I think she is a member of the Committee on the Present Danger of China. If not, we will fix that right quick, because she certainly is deserving. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and one of the countries, well, her country, Canada, as well as our country, which we like to think she thinks of as her home as well, regard as, generally speaking, the preeminent authority on matters involving Pacific Islands and their very critical strategic importance to the security of our Cleo has been recently forward deployed in the far reaches of the Central Pacific, which he correctly points out is our western frontier with actual territories of the United States among those islands. She has done a surpassingly impressive job of raising awareness about what the Chinese are doing with various political warfare stratagems to wrest those islands and dominate others that are not part of our nation for the purposes of undermining our position and maximizing their likelihood of dominating the entire Pacific and beyond. Cleo Pascal, I'm so glad to have you with us, and this is truly a God thing that you were able to make this work on extraordinarily short notice. Everybody who participates in these programs knows that they're always by short notice, but this was really a record one. So thank you for being with us. The floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you very much for including me in one of the most important topics possible. So there is, many Americans obviously know about Guam, which is American territory with American citizens. It's Guam's about a 7 or 8 hour flight west of Honolulu, but it's only about 4 hours from Tokyo or Taipei. That's how far west the United States goes, and how much it actually is, not only just in the Indo-Pacific, but in Asia. Another U.S. territory is contiguous to Guam, going north. It's called the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. And I would argue it is the part of the United States that is the most penetrated by the Chinese Communist Party, because the Chinese know that in case of a Taiwan contingency or any other activities that they want to undertake in as they break out of the first island chain, they're going to need to take Guam and the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas offline. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean kinetically. We've seen Volt Typhoon is already in the critical infrastructure in Guam, but the degree of political warfare attack of the sort described in the report that you see in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas is really off the charts and warrants very close focus. Just to give you some examples, there was a Chinese casino that was set up in the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas in 2014-2015 period. The main island in the Marianas is Saipan, and it was on the island of Saipan. And in the first 3 months of operation, according to a Bloomberg report, on less than 20 tables, it was running $5.3 billion into the U.S. financial system functionally. There were investigations eventually. The FBI seized documents, and nothing has happened. That casino went bankrupt. Its assets have now been bought by a company that was made to look Japanese, but actually the main actor is a Chinese man who took a Japanese name and seems to be closely associated with some of the previous operators of the casino. The new governor of the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands has said that he wants to open up the country to more gambling. The neighboring island, which is also American, Tinian, has announced that it's launching a stable coin to allow online gambling. This is all directed primarily at the Chinese market. And Chinese can still arrive in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands without a visa. They can get on the plane in Macau and land on U.S. soil without a visa. They're not supposed to leave the Marianas, the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, at least in the hundreds. They're illegally taking boats to Guam, where they're being found on the bases, involved in criminal activity, all sorts of things you don't want to happen. We can't get that loophole closed. This goes to, I think, some of the things that are being touched on about how it may seem remote. This is very, very far away physically, but the decisions are being made in Washington that could tighten this thing up. The Chinese arriving without a visa in CNMI, including for, as was described in Peter Schweitzer's latest book, Birth Tourism, that's not congressional. That's Homeland Security. That can be changed with the stroke of a pen by Secretary Noem. Similarly, we've got the woman that represents the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas in Congress, Kimberlyn King-Hines. She's their delegate to Congress. She participates in committees, everything up to voting in the final vote. She's actively pushing for more engagement with the Chinese market, including the lifting of caps on direct flights from mainland China into the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. What she's pushing for would also, she doesn't mention it, but would also allow unlimited flights from mainland China into Guam. So we're seeing a degree of penetration that's, I don't, I mean, if this was happening in Massachusetts, people would be enraged. The woman that ran the Bureau of Motor Vehicles in CNMI was convicted of selling U.S. driver's licenses to Chinese. She had a Chinese co-conspirator, cost about $1,700 for a U.S. driver's license if you're illegally in the country. This is all on the record, but very little is being done. One place, just for some good news, that's good things have been happening is Palau, which is an independent country just south of Guam, which is in free association with the U.S. and some history aficionados may know it as the site of the Battle of Peleliu. It's a country that recognizes Taiwan. It's in free association with the U.S. The U.S. just designated, State Department, which has been doing this important work, just designated the president of the Senate there for specifically Chinese-linked corruption. The Senate has been very obstructionist to the president of Palau, and including trying to block some of the recently signed agreements between Palau and the U.S. The headlines for those agreements are that Palau will take up to 75 deportees from the U.S., people with no criminal records who've been leaving the U.S. have to leave the U.S. They're in the country illegally, but they can't go back to their home countries for whatever reason. But the other parts of those deals are that the U.S. will help Palau, including by sending people, defend itself from cyber attacks and go after corruption and transnational organized crime, reinforce their borders, all the sort of counter-Chinese political warfare operations that are desperately needed across the region. And the Senate has been trying to block, I think, sabotage the entire package, but through the lens of blocking the 75 deportees. Now, what happened is because the president of the Senate, who's been very against anything that would help Palau-U.S. relations or Palau defend itself, because he was designated, which means that he and his immediate family can't travel to the U.S., that's now been cast as the U.S. retaliating for him holding up these agreements. And this gets to the second phase, is when you actually do start to fight back, being ahead of the narrative warfare component of it, because you've left functionally a wounded man in place who has no interest anymore at all in U.S. relations, and in fact is furious at the U.S. His immediate family can't go to the U.S. for medical care. His kids can't go for university. Those ties have now been cut. But the U.S. has, from what I've heard from colleagues in Palau, hasn't shared the information they have that warranted the designation with the authorities in Palau so that they can prosecute him domestically. So he can spin it to make it look like the U.S. is taking this out on him because for political reasons, not because they're helping Palau protect itself from this sort of corruption. So this is just to say that we've got a case where what was necessary has been done, but it needs to be part of a broader package of counter-political Chinese political warfare attacks that protects your flanks as you're moving forward. This has been, the Palau designation has been, they've been working on this for years, but it just so happens that the timing comes up when there's this other thing going on, which can be immediately used against the U.S. So you're dealing with a very sophisticated, dug-in operation that has locals acting as proxies and has a total narrative control in many senses. You talk about sort of how there's media control in the U.S. There's also media control across that region. Think tanks have been set up that promote a Chinese line, even though they look like they're being funded out of the U.S. Everything that you see in the U.S. has been expanded into other regions that are strategically critical to the U.S. So we're starting to see these very good news beginnings of a counterattack, as with the State Department report, as with the designation in Palau and also in the Marshall Islands. And now I think hopefully it'll be expanded and it'll be woven into other counters that have a chance of accomplishing what the U.S. national security strategy says it wants to accomplish, which is to help countries be more sovereign, have more independence, so that they themselves are in a better position to counter some of these really vicious and corrosive attacks that they've been under for so long. And in doing so, be not only in a better position to defend themselves, but be in a position to be a better ally in the context of this existential fight for freedom, transparency, accountability, democracy, and all the things that we're all fighting for. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I just ask you to take one more minute to give us the elevator pitch on the stakes? Why this part of the world and the focused efforts the Chinese are making through political warfare at the moment, but inexorably it will be more, I suspect, military and blackmail and maritime militia and so on operating as well. Coercively, but what is it about this part of the world that makes it imperative, not just desirable, but imperative that we be repulsing the Chinese political warfare activities?
Yes, thank you. So I've been focusing a lot on this area of the Central Pacific, which is the zone between Hawaii and Philippines and Japan. And that zone, so Guam falls into that, as does the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas, Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands. That zone, since McKinley, since the Spanish-American War, there's been an awareness that if a hostile expansionist foreign power has control in that area, then the mainland U.S. isn't safe. This was explicitly why during when the U.S. won the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took the Philippines and Hawaii. It was, McKinley specifically said, it was to secure Oregon and California. Also, it played into why Hawaii was annexed at that same year. And the issue with Hawaii and Philippines and Guam was the idea was if you've got those zones, this was the rimland theory, then you're okay. The fallacy, the problem was the U.S. hadn't secured the middle of the Pacific. And those places, Palau, what's now Palau, Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, went to the Germans, and then the Japanese took them from the Germans in World War I, and from 1914 until World War II, slowly built up and militarized the center of the Pacific. And that resulted in 100,000 Americans dying trying to get across the Pacific in order to be able to constrain yet another hostile expansionist foreign power that had gained control over the center of the Pacific. And the way that after the war, the U.S. sort of handled that was it gave the peoples, for the first time in their modern histories, a vote about their own future. And the people of the Commonwealth of Northern Marianas voted to join the U.S., and the people in the middle said, we want to be independent after hundreds of years of colonization. But they signed these compacts of free association with the U.S., which allows them to live and work freely in the U.S., to have the postal system as domestic mail, and to have this very close defense and security relationship where the U.S. is responsible for defense of the region. The defense of the region has been seen mostly as kinetic. So you've got the base in Kwajalein, for example. Now I think the concept of defense, at least what we're seeing the tender shoots growing out of State Department is an acknowledgement that defense also has to be on the political warfare front. Otherwise, China, as mentioned, is very actively trying to set up in the region, and you will get yet another hostile, aggressive, expansionist foreign power in the center of the Pacific. And again, the U.S. Will not be safe. So we're learning from the lessons of history from McKinley onwards about how important this zone is. It's not accidental that there are American territories on the western edge of the Pacific. That's a message sent from strategists from 130 years ago. You need to pay attention to this area. And the Americans out there are as American as anybody else. They're as an American as a New Yorker, and they deserve the same sort of protections and attention as any other American.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you rounding that out, because I think it makes all the more important your, I think, persuasive arguments that this is a place we have to engage to counter the Chinese political warfare, as is true of the rest of the United States as well, of course. We have one more speaker before we come to our cleanup batter, and I'm going to filibuster just for a moment to see if we can get him on the line. His name is George Racely. He has been active in the political warfare battle space, mostly domestically, but with a keen eye to the international arena as well. George has served in senior positions on Capitol Hill on the House side, as well as in the office of the Vice President of the United States. He has been, I believe, involved in over 300 political campaigns in the course of his career, ranging from presidential on down. His grasp, therefore, of the business of politics, but also politics in the sense of, influence and subversion and opposition research and exploitation. I mean, these are all tricks of the trade that I'm delighted to say, because he's on our side, he is singularly equipped with, and therefore particularly, I think, important to hear from in the course of this particular program, as to why what the Chinese are getting away with has been so harmful to us, and why we must prevent it from continuing if we can. George Racely, as if on cue, you have arrived. Thank you so much for joining us with even less notice than Cleo had, but we're really delighted to have you with us to talk a bit about, from your perspective, Code Pink and People's Forum, and revelations that they actually work for the Chinese Communist Party, and Roy Neville Singham, his funding of all of this through, presumably, serving as a pass-through, I guess I would say, for the Chinese, or anywhere else you'd like to go with this subject, sir. You're most welcome, and over to you.
Well, thank you, Frank. And let me start out by giving a little commercial for conservativehq.com. We have a article up today that goes into, some significant detail on the latest revelations in Congress about Singham's nefarious activities. And I'm delighted to report to your audience that the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee is doing a stupendous job of digging into this, and hopefully more will be confirmed. He has sent letters to some of Singham's entities that are operating here in America on behalf of the Communist Chinese, or as I like to call them, the Red Chinese, because they are a revolutionary state. And so we'll see if those letters elicit a response other than a go jump in a lake from their lawyers. But of course, after that, the next step could be a subpoena, and we would certainly hope that the chairman takes that step if he doesn't get satisfaction through the normal course of inquiry. But the reason that this is so important is that Singham and various other operatives have been interfering in American elections for quite some time. And there's a good bit of evidence that a big chunk of what happens in the Democratic Party is funded or guided by the Communist Chinese. And there's a lot of questions, for example, about what used to be called Act Blue and its money laundering operations, and where all of these small donations that the donors didn't know they gave came from. Where did that cash come from? And some people suspect with good reason that it came from Communist China or Communist China related entities. And so allegedly that's being looked at by the feds, supposedly the FBI, the Federal Election Commission. We'll see where that goes. Some of these wheels grind exceedingly slowly. And, should things go south and the Democrats gain the majority in the House, there'll be huge distractions from any further inquiry into this. Those of us that remember what happened after the Holy Land Foundation trial and Obama was elected president, and suddenly there were no further investigations of the Islamic terror supporting network here in America. And so we can count on that happening to any investigation of the Red Chinese election interference network should Democrats gain further influence over the process. So that's kind of the state of play there as I see it, and be glad to take any questions, or if you've got any follow-up to that, Frank, why let's go.
George, thank you, and well done on the article. Conservative HQ, to put a further plug into it, is a remarkable newsletter sponsored by Richard Vigory, edited by George Raisley, and with something like 250,000 subscribers. And we consider that a tremendous force multiplier for good in this country. George, thank you for being a member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China and serving in that very important role as well as Conservative HQ. We're going to clean up batter. Is the man that we usually turn to for the role, and that would be Brian Kennedy, the chairman of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, former president of the Claremont Institute, now the president of the American Strategy Group, and the author of a very aptly named book. I believe it is China's War Inside America from Encounter Books. Brian Kennedy, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your leadership in all of these areas and for serving so faithfully as the man who synthesizes what we've been talking about and takes it home.
Well, thank you, Frank. Great to be with you, of course, as always, and thank you for your leadership. We couldn't do all of this without your diligence and intellect and determination to alert Americans about the Chinese Communist threat. First of all, let me associate myself with everything that's been said so far. I thought what Cleo Pascal was talking about regarding the Northern Mariana Islands was quite interesting. She said it before. She's very consistent about all that. I would only add that my father in World War II was a Marine, and he fought at Tarawa, Saipan, and Tinian, the latter two which are part of the Northern Mariana Islands. And I can say that the U.S. Marines fought valiantly there and sacrificed a lot of Americans for those two islands. And it's an example of how to think about strategy and politics, that you have to fight wars where they need to be fought, And just because they're far away doesn't mean it's not in the U.S. interest. And so all praise to Cleo for staying on that. The one thing I'm concerned about with regards to this new report is that we might be looking at too small a target. And all praise to Sarah Rogers, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, for putting out this report. It's a good thing to do, good for Congress to be looking at all these things. But I fear, as I say, that it's small ball, when in fact, as the work of the committee has demonstrated time and again, the problem is radically bigger than just Neville Singham and Code Pink. Yes, good to highlight this, but they're very small players overall in all this. The Communist Chinese spend tens of billions of dollars in intelligence and influence operations annually in the United States. Code Pink is a couple million of, crazy people who go to rallies and protest and do those kind of things. And of course, that's not nothing, but it's not the magnitude of tens of billions of dollars that get spread every single year throughout American society in order to buy off and corrupt American political elites and Americans all over the country who are in any position of power. Counter to that tens of billions of dollars, you would think the United States would have a counterintelligence capacity in this country that would be in the billions. And President Trump, I think, if left to his own devices, would have an active counterintelligence operation going here in the United States. And I think I would expect he would think it's already going on. But much of that counterintelligence was dismantled during the Biden administration. And I believe it's yet to be reconstituted. Even before the Biden administration, it was inadequate to deal with communist China and their tens of billions of dollars spent annually. The problem is so big that I believe many within the intelligence community thought that we simply couldn't have enough counterintelligence officers operating in the United States to deal with the magnitude of the problem. They have over 300,000 students here in the United States. How are we to look after 300,000 students in the United States who are in American universities, graduate schools, etc.? We can pick off one or two here and there, and those stories get publicized annually. But overall, we have a kind of benign neglect, which is not so benign when you look at everything that Communist China is doing to steal our intellectual property, which still will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually here in the United States. And so from Communist China's point of view, everything they do here in this country is a very good investment. Those tens of billions in intelligence and influence operation yield hundreds of billions and eventually trillions of dollars that have gone to them because, as we know, America is an open society. We're not a closed society, obviously, like Communist China with their credit scoring and their monitoring of all sorts of domestic activities. We're an open society. So we have a unique challenge that we face in trying to have a free country and yet deal with the world and this global communist movement that has penetrated the country and is on a daily basis operating in such a way as to undermine our republic. I'm just finishing up a long piece on our elections and the need to nationalize our elections, something President Trump has talked about. One of the reasons is because our election system is done with electronic voting. And that electronic voting is done on machines that are made in Communist China using components from Communist China. Sometimes they're made in Communist China and sent to Taiwan and then sold to the United States. But the idea that we would let our voting system be built in communist China or in any foreign country is absolutely insane and suicidal. Those same voting machines that are built in communist China run software that was developed in Venezuela, a communist enemy nation of the United States. And so when you look at all these things, whether it's Code Pink or our election system or our immigration problems, I mean, we haven't mentioned on this show, but I'll do it, that there are 200,000 Chinese men of military age who came to the United States during the Biden administration. And they came here and they melded into the country almost seamlessly. These appear to be special forces. And I'd like it, if they're not special forces, I'd like it proven to us they're not special forces. But they've gone throughout the country. The Chinese own, hundreds of thousands of acres of land in the United States. They have the ability to have to operate today in on those Chinese lands. They have the ability to have melded into America's big cities, many of which have Chinatowns, but many of which just have such large Chinese populations that they could have been absorbed into that too. Where today is DHS and ICE going after those 200,000 Chinese nationals who look to be Chinese special forces who are here in the United States? It's very difficult to take seriously at some level. And again, all praise to Undersecretary Rogers for doing what she did in highlighting Code Pink. But if we're going to vote in a voting system that is made in communist China, and we're going to allow 200,000 men of military age to live here in the United States without us rooting them out, it's hard to take seriously that the United States is really going to solve the problem of Chinese influence in the United States. Just having more transparency about who the donors are to Code Pink or any of these organizations it seems to me, I won't say it's beside the point because it is real, but we have to have a whole of government approach to what China is doing to our country. We don't have that today. President Trump has articulated that communist China is operating in such a way as to be understood as an enemy of the country. They do the kind of things that suggest they are an enemy. And although President Trump has said this, he has yet to have a government that is capable of fulfilling his strategic designs. Would be I think the best way of putting it. He believes this is a serious problem, but DHS has not followed through. The FBI has not followed through. Our CIA, which should operate abroad, I don't think it always does, they should be reporting back to us on what they're doing to make sure the Chinese influence abroad does not enter into the United States. This is a failure, it seems to me, Frank, of an enormous magnitude that we're just not getting right. And I would just caution the audience that just because we're going after Code Pink today doesn't mean that the government is preparing for those bigger problems that I just described. Today, we don't have, and this is one of the themes of this piece I'm writing, we don't have an executive order or legislation to outlaw these Chinese voting machines in our country. And that's something that I'm encouraging the president to do at once. I think on the natural, he has said we can't vote using these voting machines. But then we have to take the next step and make sure that we have fair elections in this country. We have to make sure that we're rooting out those 200,000 Chinese special forces, I'll call them, here in the country. And we have to build a counterintelligence capability that makes sure that no foreign power, including Communist China, can do things to harm this country. And so today, as encouraged as I am by this report, I am also deeply concerned that we're not doing enough quickly enough to get this right. So thank you, Frank, for
Thank you, Brian.
for this webinar.
Yeah, no, brilliant point. I just feel constrained to add, when you're talking about the voting processes being penetrated and subverted by the Chinese Communist Party. The book that I mentioned a moment ago, Peter Schweitzer's The Invisible Coup, talks about how the Chinese are using birthright citizenship to create a whole cohort of American voters, maybe 18 years from now, but nonetheless, who, after being born here, by virtue of a pregnant Chinese woman coming here, giving birth, and then taking the baby home, and living under communist, indoctrination from that point to the point where they get the chance to vote as American citizens. There's a whole nother level of outrage that we must address as well. I have to drop off at the bottom of the hour, but just two quick questions to you both, our remaining speakers. Brian, maybe to you. I don't think mention has been made of the United Front Work Department as an instrument of the Chinese Communist Party for the purpose of waging political warfare. I've heard you assign a very sizable amount of money, and you may have alluded to it just now, to the annual funding of their activities here. Could you speak to that point a little bit, and just how extraordinary the commitment of the Chinese to this practice of such warfare is?
Yeah, thank you, Frank. It was thought maybe 7 or 8 years ago it was $16 billion a year. Today I'm putting that number at over 20. By all accounts, everyone I speak to about this, that it's a substantially larger number, and that 20 billion doesn't even count what they're paying for their students to come to American universities. To be sure, that number in American universities adds up to about $40 billion annually in the United States, which is one of the reasons, because it's 40 billion, people are reluctant to remove those students from the country. But those students, I would add, are almost all children of the Chinese Communist Party, who are part of their operation to penetrate the United States. But between that and the United Front work, and money is fungible. Money is very hard to trace, especially when you don't have the counterintelligence capacity to see where it's going. We do this on a very small scale today. I've talked to former FBI agents who say the magnitude of the problem is so great that we would need an FBI that is so much larger than it is today to try to deal with this, that we simply don't talk about it. So those United Front operations that are here in this country that do engage in political warfare, we by and large just let those things pass. And that's something that simply has to stop today. They're well funded, they're motivated, they see themselves as on the winning side to take down the country. We have to wake up as a people that we're going to build an apparatus to one, those people who shouldn't be in the country should be removed from the country. Those people who are operating illegally need to be arrested. They need to be treated like the criminals that they are here in this country. It's active espionage and influence operations meant to take down the United States. This is not support of free citizens in this country who have political grievances. This is an active political operation to subvert the United States and its Constitution.
Well said. Lastly, to you, George Raisley, Brian is working on some recommendations for the president in this space. If you had his ear, what would yours be, sir?
Well, one of the things that Brian brought up, which I would like to put a slightly finer point on, is that these, at present, hundreds of thousands, eventually it'll be millions of birthright citizen Chinese who have never lived here can indeed vote. And in fact, in many states, they can register to vote without even coming here. Once they've got their passport, they can register to vote and they can cast a vote without ever setting foot in the United States. And so we need to be very cognizant of tightening up our election system, of making sure, number one, that it's only citizens that are voting, and number two, that they're citizens that are indeed in actual engaged in the civic life of this country.
Amen. Gentlemen, we're going to wrap it with that. So much more to say, truthfully, but I think we've covered incredibly important ground here. And I want to thank each of our speakers, Jim Fennell, the incomparable Jan Jekielek, Grant Newsham, the equally impressive John Lanchowski, Cleo Pascal, fresh back from the far reaches of the Pacific, George Ritzley, and Brian Kennedy. I'm deeply indebted to all of you for what you do when you're not on these programs, but especially for your contribution to this particular program. And we're deeply indebted, I think, also to our audience, and I hope it will be a vast one. And that in part will depend upon word of mouth, and those of you who have caught this live, taking it on yourselves to make sure that others in your circles of influence are exposed to this content as well. Let me simply say that we are now in the closing clinches of the electoral process for this year. It is perhaps, for reasons that Brian and George specifically have addressed, possibly as fraught an election as any that we've had. There is so much riding on it, especially the possibility that the things that we've been talking about, that the president has been getting right, his administration has been doing, notably these remarkable State Department reports, will all be undone if people like this character, who I think among the other things that needs to come out of all of this is the criminal prosecution of Neville Roy Singham. I've mangled his name several times. I apologize for that. I'm going to try to commit it to memory because he is the poster child, as far as I'm concerned, of the evil influence operators that are at work in this country or against it, at the very least, from places like Shanghai, where he resides. His wife, by the way, I don't think this was mentioned, is a co-founder of Code Pink. And therefore, he's not only of the enemy, he's sleeping with the enemy, as far as I'm concerned. This must stop. And this is the place to begin doing so. God bless all of you. God bless our country. And God bless the cause of freedom for which our Committee on the Present Danger strives. Take care. We'll talk with you next week. Over and out.